Good morning, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to give this talk. It's great to come back to a robotics conference. It's actually been a few years since I've come to ICRA, and it's really exciting to see all of the changes and all of the developments. So I changed the title of my talk because I'm going to talk about navigation specifically. And this is an area that's dear to my heart. I think that the problems that you confront during your PhD end up sort of sticking with you for a long time. Right, so let's go. What is navigation? Well, in a complex environment, then navigation tries to answer a few questions. First of all, where am I? And where am I going? And then there are a few other questions that we might want to answer along the way. Where did I start? Given 2 points, how far away are they? And what's the shortest path between them? Have I been here before? And as anyone who's taken a car trip with children knows, the important one is how long until we get there. And I think that really navigation for me is about solving a conjunction of problems. A representation, memory for storing that representation and for doing inference within, and control for taking actions and deciding on what policy to take. And this means that navigation is actually a little bit more powerful and more fundamental than just getting across town or running in a maze. Really, navigation is at the core of our biological being. Navigation is so fundamental that we use it for things like the memory palace or a mind palace. I don't know if many of you have heard of this. Maybe Sherlock recently popularized this a little bit. But the idea here, this has been around for 100 years or so, and the idea is that it's a way to memorize things. And all of the mnemonists, a professional mnemonist, somebody who's memorizing things, uses this trick to remember an arbitrary sequence of things. You can do this yourself. The idea is to simply place the things that you want to remember in your house, in your mind. So if I want to remember a grocery list that has a loaf of bread, olive oil, and I don't know, some tomatoes, then what I would do is think, I'm going to imagine an oversized loaf of bread sitting on my living room sofa. I'm going to imagine olive oil filling up my bathtub, and I'm going to imagine tomatoes hanging from a light fixture like a Christmas tree ornament. Then when I go to the store, I simply have to walk through my house in my mind and say, what's that loaf of bread doing there? I need to buy it. This works incredibly well. This is how I manage my weekly shopping. Try it too. Anyway, I just point this out to say that although I'm going to talk about navigation, I think that this is a more fundamental part of who we are than we usually think. So let's talk about representation first. We love representation. If we're building a robot to navigate, what's the first thing we do? We want to know how to build a map, right? SLAM involves localizing and mapping. And we love maps. We use them a lot as humans, of course. Getting here involved understanding many external representations and using those to better navigate. But any of us would be able to throw away those external representations and simply use our own mind to navigate, right? Animals do this, and if we throw away our phones and go wander out into Brisbane, I guarantee you will pay a lot more attention to the landmarks you see and to which way you turned at the corner so that you can find your way back again. And we have this ability. And that's because the more powerful representation, I would argue, is the internal one. It's the neurons that we have, and it's how those encode places and landmarks and things and routes. And that's the thing that I'd like to understand and see if we can put that into a deep learning architecture. So we've had some insight as to how this works in the brain, in the biological brain, by doing things like this to rats. So recording from specific neurons in mice and in rats, as they do things like navigate a maze or simply run around in a room. And this has led to our current understanding in neuroscience of a few different types of specialized cells. I'm just going to mention two of them, place cells and grid cells. So place cells were discovered by recording from rats, from single neurons in rats in the 1970s. And the idea here is that a single neuron would fire only when the rat is in one specific place. So having one neuron that fires when I am in this position and another one that fires there. And it allows you to recognize I am here and know that with certainty. Grid cells, on the other hand, were discovered much more recently in 2004. And Edvard and May-Britt Moser won the Nobel Prize in Anatomy in 2014 for their work on grid cells. And grid cells fire periodically. So as I cross the room, I have grid cells that will fire as I cross the room regularly. So this gives a way of understanding the world in a metric sense. And there's a little cartoon here that shows that as the rat runs around the room, and we record from that neuron, then we can look over time, and we can see that this forms this pattern. Notably, the pattern has to be in different scales, and it needs to have a hexagonal structure. And these are a couple of the key characteristics that neuroscientists look for to say, yes, that neuron is a grid cell. So the work that we've done over the last 3 years is in a paper that just came out 2 weeks ago. It's called Vector-Based Navigation Using Grid-like Representations in Artificial Agents. Andrea at DeepMind and Caswell at UCL are the lead authors on this paper. And the main claims of the paper are that grid cells can emerge simply from training an RNN to do a navigation task, to do path integration. And secondly, grid cells are an effective basis for vector-based navigation. That means doing things like shortcuts, being able to point to your hotel, even though you've taken a complicated route away from there. So I should mention there has been a lot of other work on grid cells for robotics, notably RatSlam, which Michael Milford worked on, and using constraints like slowness or sparseness allows grid cells to be computational models of grid cells. And there's also been recently an independent confirmation of some of our results from a group at Columbia. All right, so first of all, how do grid cells emerge? Well, we have this simple neural architecture here. We have an LSTM, an RNN, and we feed that with a velocity signal from trajectories of a rat running around a square room. There's a linear layer on top of that, and then a prediction of whether or not we've gotten to different locations in the room, which we would say are sort of synthetic place cells. So it's learning how to integrate my velocity over time to figure out where I am, path integration. And remarkably, if you do this, and importantly, in the fully connected layer there that's marked as being the grid code, you need to apply regularization there, noise injection, and dropout. And if you do that, you get grid cells. As in, if you record from different neurons in that LSTM, and you record their firing rate over time as our simulated rat runs around a room, then what you get are these types of rate maps, which are shown with their grittiness score, a neuroscience term. And they show up not only looking like grid cells, but they're also they're strikingly similar to the biological cells. So we find that grid cells emerge, and head direction cells emerge, and border recognition cells emerge. And they emerge in the same proportion to what we see in a rat, remarkably. And they show the same tuning properties, and they have the same scaling. So it's remarkably similar, considering that we're coming from a completely different direction of an LSTM, trained using gradient descent. So we can change our architecture a little bit, and instead of learning from just velocity, we can learn from vision as well. And so this integrates a CNN, a convolutional neural network, and as well as the velocity signal, and with the same supervised learning. And then we can wrap this up in an RL setting. So in a reinforcement learning setting, we want to feed these codes over time into another LSTM, which we're then going to train using A3C, which is asynchronous advantage actor-critic algorithm. And this is an algorithm that learns a value function and a policy from its inputs in order to maximize reward signal in an environment. And so we can take this agent that we've created, and we can see how it does in mazes. In this maze, the agent needs to find a goal location marked there, and then it needs to get back to that same location again and again. So on each episode of this little maze navigation game, then we generate a new maze. So every time it's got a different layout, it even has a different wallpaper, different features, and there's a goal somewhere in that maze. The agent needs to find its way to the goal, and then it immediately is teleported somewhere else, and it needs to find its way back again and again and again. Each time it gets to the goal, it gets 10 points. So it's a classic explore, exploit type of task. And what we find is we compare the grid cell agent that I just showed to a place cell agent that actually has direct information about where it is over time. It actually is, we just give it directly an encoding saying, you are here or you are there. But the grid cell agent actually does better than that. It does significantly better than the place cell agent and also just a plain A3C agent. And it does better than a human playing this game, which is what the dotted line is in the middle of the learning curves there. And I should mention that this maze also has dynamic doors, which means that basically, randomly during the episode, we're going to open and close doors. So finding one route to the goal isn't good enough. You might have to find a different route and go around a new obstacle in your way. We also looked at vector-based navigation. So this is the question as to whether or not the agent can point towards the goal. So even if it needs to go through some path like that to get to that target, to get to that goal location, the question is whether or not that representation is encoding the actual straight direction as the bird would fly. And this is seen as being a key property of what rats can do and what we can do, and it's important. And indeed, we find that the grid cell agent is using those grid codes in order to do exactly that, be able to point towards the goal over time. And this enables it to do shortcut behavior, which, again, is a very important characteristic of intelligent creatures. So the agent was trained first on the maze environment, and then it was put in this new environment, which you can see here. First, all of these doors are closed, doors 1, 2, 3, 4, and only door 5 is open, so that it can get through to the goal. And then we opened up the other doors, and the question is, what does the agent do? Well, the grid cell agent makes a beeline and does a shortcut, even though it has not seen that door open before in this environment. And we did another set of experiments there on the bottom, comparing the grid cell agent to the place cell agent. And the place cell agent essentially memorizes a path to get to the goal, keeps on doing that, whereas the grid cell agent can take shortcuts, which is very important. So, like I said, we just published this in Nature a couple weeks ago. There's a lot of fascinating experiments in the paper. It's more for a neuroscience audience, but I encourage you to take a look at it. And these are all the authors on it. And the most exciting thing for me was that after we published it, Edvard Moser, who, like I said, won the Nobel Prize for grid cell research, and he published his own response to this. And in it, he said that, called it an incredible study, that we found an artificial agent that only has access to a few sensory motor cues, spontaneously forms grid cells with properties remarkably similar to those in the brain. And this paper highlights the power of studying artificial intelligence for understanding our own brains. All right, let me go back now to my conjunction of different puzzles here, representation, control, and memory. And at the same time when we were working on this grid cell work, we were also working on another architecture that focuses more on the memory side of it. So the idea is that we would like to have an explicit, a neural memory where we can put our representations and then make decisions and do inference based on what's in that memory. And we'd like to train the whole thing end to end at the same time. So how do we do this? Well, for the representation side of it, then what we use is a sequential variational autoencoder. And the idea there is that that will hopefully train a very good representation, a latent representation there, and that will allow us to put the right sort of information into the memory. And it's a sequential variational autoencoder because there's a KL loss between the prior and the posterior over each step of training. And then it also has the standard reconstruction loss, and that's how it's trained. Now for memory, what we use is a differentiable neural computer, a DNC. This was something that DeepMind was working on a couple of years ago. And it's sort of notoriously hard to train using reinforcement learning. Easier to train supervised, but we really wanted this to be only reinforcement learning that trained this. So we constructed this and hoped that we could manage to put the right information, learn to store it in the memory matrix of a DNC, and then learn to read it out and take actions. So for actions, we use A3C again for the reinforcement learning. And together, we've called this architecture MERLIN, for Memory-Enabled Reinforcement Learning. And if you look here, the flow is very interesting. So we get images in, we encode them into a latent code that's low-dimensional. Then that's given to the right head, the right controller of the DNC, which is itself an LSTM. And that right controller has to figure out where to slot this into memory, whether to overwrite something else, whether to modify it or put it in as is. It has that control, but needs to learn it. And then the read head, which is another LSTM controller, has to learn where to look over time, what to pull out, and what to feed to the policy that then takes actions. It's a complex system, but it actually works. It's amazing considering that when we start out, it's all just noise, it's all just random weights. But just through learning in an environment with the sparse reward and trying to maximize that reward, then this all comes together and works. Slightly miraculous from my point of view. And this is the paper that you'll find this in, just recently put on archive, and the lead author there is Greg Wayne. And in the paper, we have this view, this alternate view of it. So if you'd like more detail, then definitely take a look at this figure instead. I decided not to walk through this here. But note that in pink, you see the three losses that are simply combined here. One being the policy loss to learn the reinforcement learning policy, the standard reconstruction loss for an autoencoder, and like I said, the sequential prediction loss that ties together the prior and the posterior. So how does it work? We look again at this maze type of environment where the agent is trying to find the goal and then return back there again. And we can compare MERLIN against sort of an ablated version where we take away the DNC or we take away the sequential VAE and try to learn it anyway. And really putting together the representation and the memory is the key thing that makes this work extremely well and allows MERLIN to do very well. It does as well as the grid cell agent on the same task. And we can see that it's using its memory. So this little plot looks at how long it takes to reach the goal every time. So the first time it wakes up at the beginning of the episode, it doesn't know where the goal is, so it always takes 110 steps on average, takes that many steps. But then as it keeps on getting back to the goal again and again and again, it's using its memory, so it's making shortcuts and going faster and faster. We can look at the return prediction, which means how soon is the agent starting to predict, I'm getting to the goal, when its value function spikes. and we see that the error on that return prediction is lower for MERLIN compared to the other one. So more evidence that it is correctly understanding the task and understanding using its memory. Here's a quick video that shows the agent actually navigating here. So first, the exploration phase. It's trying to find that goal, and it's just found it. Now it's finding its way back again. No, there the goal is found. And now each time the goal is found, the agent is coming back to it again and again. You can see it zooming around from the bird's eye view. The actual view from the agent is, of course, just this first-person view. And each time it's correctly predicting that it's going to be getting that reward soon. We can also look at how well it decodes. So how well does it reconstruct its input? And there's a nice sort of trade-off here between you can get very good reconstructions using the autoencoder, but that actually makes your performance worse. The agent is best when it's in this middle zone of just sort of fuzzy reconstructions, not that crisp of reconstruction, but it's able to then learn the task better. So this is a little visualization that shows what the read head is looking at in the memory. So where were these cells created? And so it just starts to sort of scaffold its motion. So it's persistently drawing from memory in exactly the places where it saw the goal coming from different angles. And so it's noisy, it's not a map, it's sort of a, we're using these methods to try to look inside and see what's going on, but it works. That's the important thing for me. Can also look at rapid reward evaluation. This is what we call this, rapid reward valuation, sorry. The task here, you wake up in a big room, there's lots of objects, you go and eat them. Some of them are good and some of them are bad, right? Some of them are tasty and some of them are poison. And then you have to try to, you have to go to another room and you have to try to find only the good ones. So you're having to learn that, okay, this time ice cream cones are good, and so I'm going to try to eat more of them in the second room that I see. So you're rapidly binding your estimate of reward to visual percepts, keeping that in memory, and then using that to do well on the next task. And MERLIN can do this very well because, again, it has this representation and it has memory together. That's a different video than I thought it was going to be. This is a water maze task, and where the agent needs to find a hidden platform, and then it has to go through several other rooms, and then it comes back here again and tries to find that same location again. This is similar to the Morris water maze. If any of you have studied rat navigation, you know that this is sort of a classic experiment. I'm just going to skip this, though. And right, so that's all I wanted to say about MERLIN. Like I said, there's a paper with a lot of very sort of deep and interesting experiments, I think, that were done there, specifically thinking about memory and representation. But this brings us to the elephant in the room. I always like elephants in rooms. The elephant in the room is the fact that all of the experiments that I've shown you use a simulator. Right? It uses these generated mazes that we made using DeepMind Lab, by the way, DM Lab. And they're great. They're complex, they're pretty, they have different features. It's a first-person environment. It's partially observed. We can make all of these procedural variations. We can make sort of an infinite display. But, it's not real. And I think that that's a problem, especially if we want to think about how would this apply to robots, for instance. With all of the complexity that I built into these mazes, it's a really, really tiny piece of the great world that we navigate in. So we really need to figure out ways in which we can push forward and have complexity and also scale, right? So visual complexity, but also scale. So the the environments that I've just been showing you, here's the caption in the paper. It says, large environment. I wouldn't call that large. It's still pretty small. It's very challenging, and I think that don't get me wrong, all of the research that we've done is, I think, really good research. But instead, we want to be doing navigation in complex environments that are at Brisbane scale, right? So that brings us to the knowledge. The knowledge, those of you who are from London may know about this. The rest of you, I will let you know. The knowledge is a test for aspiring black cab drivers in London. They have to pass this test in order to get a license. Candidates study for this test for 3 to 4 years, full-time, driving around the city of London and studying it because they have to memorize all 25,000 roads and 20,000 named locations that are within 6-mile radius of Charing Cross. And the way in which they're tested is they're given a start and an end, and they need to list out exactly the roads that they would take to get from A to B within this broad loop around London. So people who want to train for this, at the beginning they already have slightly larger than normal hippocampi. This is because presumably they already know they've got a good memory. By the time they've passed the exam, their hippocampi are significantly enlarged. This is a study that was done by a neuroscientist at UCL. And I'll just show you, I've got here a little video of that guy, and he is reciting the directions that you would need to take to get across London.
Right into Harrington Road. Go right into forward south, Harrington Road, go right to Queensgate, cross Cromwell Road, forward Queensgate continued, left into Queensgate Place, left into Queensgate Place Mews, left into Cromwell Road, set down on my left side. Yeah, can I set down on the left? Sort of running.
All right, so I just played for you the last few seconds of it. It's a long route, and it's an impressive feat for humans. So, can we do this with reinforcement learning? Can we solve navigation tasks in the real world? So, like I said, I've been using these mazes with this type of an observation and that sort of an underlying structure. But what we would like to use is cities, where the observation would simply be an RGB view on the world, and the underlying structure would be Google Maps, something that we can use in order to construct the problem and place rewards. So this is just what we did. We used Street View. We turned Street View into a RL environment, into an interactive environment where we could make games, where we could make puzzles, where we could make navigation tasks, and train an agent. And so there's the Street View images, the underlying Google Maps, which the agent never sees. It only ever sees the visual component. We can crop these from the panoramas that form the nodes in Street View. And we can take actions where the agent gets to rotate left or right, and it gets to take a step to the next node if there is a node in front of it in the underlying graph. And this work I'm going to describe is in learning to navigate in cities without a map. Piotr Murawski is the lead author on that, and you can find it on arXiv or off of my website. So we created this environment in New York City and London and Paris. You can get an idea of some of the diversity that's there in these different areas. The underlying graphs are diverse as well. Very complex in London. London's got some wacky connectivity in its maps, let me tell you. So each of these different data sets has 14,000 to 16,000 panoramas, nodes, in the graphs that we use, and they cover a range of 3 to 5 kilometers per city. So not quite at the scale of the knowledge, but not far, but getting close. And we're going to release this data set and the environment later this year so that everybody can work on this and compare against our benchmarks. So the task that we designed is we call the Courier Task or the taxi task. You need to get from point A to point B. What you're given is the agent gets, like I said, it gets a visual observation, and it gets a reward when it gets close to the goal. So within a couple hundred meters of the goal, then it gets a reward, and then it gets given a new one. So it goes from one goal. Once it reaches that one goal, it gets to another goal. And the question is, how do we tell the agent where to go to, what goal it's trying to get to? How do we convey that? Just an image would be far too ambiguous at this scale. We can't just give an image of a tree and expect it to find that tree in New York City. So instead, we wanted to go for something that was biologically motivated. So we randomly chose a bunch of fixed landmarks, just locations in the city, and we give the agent the goal as a vector of distances to those landmarks that are nearby. And the agent doesn't get to use this while it's learning, it just gets it as a fixed representation, so it's not relative to the agent. It needs to figure out where it is based on the images. And we tried a few different architectures. So this is sort of the simplest one, where we have an A3C algorithm. We've got a convnet to process the images, and we've got a LSTM, and then the policy that's being learned, and the value function, pi and v. And we add in a couple of additional, so X is the image that's being fed in, G is this goal description, this vector of distances to nearby landmarks, and we feed in the previous action and previous reward, A and R. We also took a look at separating out this representation of the goal in a modular way. So adding another LSTM, that is going to predict head direction, predict sort of the compass of the environment, and it feeds its output directly into what we call the policy LSTM. And this is sort of reminiscent of what we did with the grid cell architecture. It was definitely inspired by that, to have this dual pathway and sort of more modular approach. And this works. We could actually learn in all of these cities. We did need to use curriculum. So when the agent starts out training, all of the goals that it's trying to get to are nearby, are within 500 meters. So if it blindly searches around, it's going to, get a reward and start to understand the problem. Then we gradually move those random goal locations further and further away in the city until it's covering the entire 5-kilometer space of the task. And that's why you get sort of this funny shape here of the one on the right. The one on the left is London, and we're comparing the different architectures. The one on the right is in London, and where we needed the curriculum for that. New York was smaller and easier to learn in, and so we didn't need to use the curriculum there. So how does this work? I've got a little video here. It's even got some nice music, soothing music. So this is in London, as you can recognize from, oh no, sorry, Paris. So that doesn't look like London. And so it's needed to cross the river on a bridge, and it's needed to get to the goal there, as you can see in the little map. Right, so just a little clip, and now here, this is in London. So we get to one goal, it immediately is given another goal, and then it's given a third one. This one, it needs to cross the Thames there, pick a bridge to cross, and get to the last one within the episode. Right. All right. So we also want to look at how well does it do, not just look at the pretty videos, although we were happy to see those. So we can look at things like, what if we plot the number of steps that the agent takes to get to the goal versus how far the goal is away from the agent in a straight line measure. And the blue points are in London, and the red points are in New York. And you can see that this is linearly correlated, which means that we are scaling to the full size of the environment, as opposed to the performance falling apart once we got to goals that were, a kilometer away. We're really learning the entire space of the environment, from short distance goals all the way through to the longest ones, the furthest ones. We can also take a look at So this is on the top, this is the route that it takes to get to a sequence of goals in London. And beneath there, you can see the value function. If we plot out the value function of the agent as it's going from a lot of different random start locations to one single end location in London, at St. Paul's. And you can see that no matter where the agent starts, it takes these routes and its value increases. So it knows where it's going. It knows where it's going and it expects to get to that goal where the heat shows, of the color shows how high its value is, its expectation of reward. And we can plot the same thing in New York. Also notice how different the layout of the streets is and how different the agent is in terms of its behaviors here. And we also see a relatively complex sequence of 3 goals that it gets to, and also the heat map there. And this is for an agent, again, starting at a randomly selected 100 different locations and all going towards Washington Square in New York City. We looked at one other architecture and one other problem here, and that's transfer learning. We weren't satisfied with just training one agent to learn one city, because even a cabbie that has learned all of London can certainly go to New York and figure out how to get around and learn to drive a cab there as well. So we wanted also for our architecture to be able to transfer. So that involves this balance between memorization of the city that you're in, but also being able to transfer some part of it so you don't need to learn from scratch in a new city. So we took this sort of modular architecture and we said, okay, what if we just train a new, what we call the city LSTM, this side one here. What if we only retrain that one? And we leave the rest of the architecture fixed. And would that work for being able to train? So this sort of shows the comparison that we did. So we can look at just if we train on a single city, how well do we do there? How well do we do if we train on multiple cities all at the same time? And then how well do we do if we train on multiple cities at the same time and then transfer to a new city, freeze the convolutional network, freeze the policy LSTM, and only train that LSTM in the middle on the new city? Does that actually work? Have we learned something that's general enough in the ConvNet and in the policy LSTM that we can learn just that new city LSTM? And this does work. It's successful. It's not as good as just memorizing a single city, but it transfers. So we can have an agent that goes from New York to London to Paris and is able to learn faster in Paris because of the other knowledge. The study in the paper is done using New York. So here we train in Harlem. We train in Central Park, which looks very different because we've now got Central Park, and it also makes the topology an interesting problem, and Greenwich Village. And then we are going to transfer now. So this is, we've trained this network, and we're going to substitute out a new LSTM there in the middle, and we're going to train that on Lower Manhattan. And it's just interesting to me. We're certainly used to taking a trained ConvNet and applying it, freezing it and applying it to some new problem, but we don't usually take the output, the policy LSTM, and freeze that as well. So that's the interesting thing here, at least for me. All right. I'm just about done, but I wanted to present this little cheeky slide that I took from Vincent Van Ook, who's here somewhere. Thank you, Vincent. So the question is whether or not end-to-end deep learning is in the future of robots. And I'm going to give an argument from history. So before 2010, this was the state-of-the-art approach for speech recognition. The input for the speech recognition problem is audio. The output is text. On the way, there was a sequence of modular components to this that were trained separately, deployed separately, an acoustic model, phonetic model, language model. And in 2010, the new state of the art was a deep network trained end-to-end from inputs to outputs. you may see where I'm going with this. In 2012, or prior to 2012, the state of the art for computer vision was held by methods that looked something like this: extract key points, sift features, maybe a deformable part model. That gets you from pixels to labels of your computer vision problem. And in 2012, as we all probably know, then a deep net trained end-to-end achieved the new state of the art by quite a bit. Prior to 2014, machine translation looked like this. Again, deep nets became the new state of the art. Which brings us to robotics. In robotics, we have the input being sensors and the output being actions. And I would say that most of the approaches out there have a set of different things that are a set of different modular parts: a perception system, a world model or a map or some representation, planning, control, before getting to the actions. So I leave it to you. To me, this is maybe an overly simplified, but it's also a compelling view. I think that there is a huge amount that we can do if we can train neural networks end-to-end, fully differentiable, to get us right from the rawest sensors all the way to the actions. All right, and with that, I'd just like to say thanks to my collaborators. These are the papers, the 3 papers that I talked about, and I started to put photographs of the people on the slide, realized it wasn't going to work, so just here a list. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. So a question about this grid-like thing is kind of RNN, if you read out from RNN, then similar states will have kind of similar representations. And the words or rooms it was trained in are also grid-like, a maze with rooms in a grid structure. Do you think, or did you test that the same grid structure readout would emerge if you train in like straight corridors or open plane environments?
So yes, we did look at, in mazes, you get something that's a little bit more complex. They don't look like clean grid cells. You get more things that fire anytime you're at, for instance, a T intersection. So you still get sort of interesting activations, but it's not as biologically tied, close as what we get. So the grid cells, initially as we're training, there's an interesting video that we have that shows how the representation changes over time. Something that neuroscientists are really excited about, because in a rat you can't record over a lifetime of learning, but in a neural network then you can. And we show that initially you do get something that's much more diffuse across the entire area, because you're going to have similar representation for these similar areas, and that then over time, with learning and with regularization, you get this crisp performance of this hexagonal firing structure that emerges, that measures distance.
Hi.
Thanks for that talk. That was really, really interesting and really well done. But, Bitcoin recently, we have seen that the energy consumption for mining Bitcoin is starting to match as much as small countries. And I've seen some recent papers in Artificial Life looking at the cost of evolutionary algorithms in energy. Have you looked at the energy consumption for these algorithms? Because what that gets to is whether this has to be done by this sort of learning can be a central service, or whether it can be put in end-user consumer products or not in the near term. I think that's an interesting question about these techniques.
So for all of the things that I presented, the question is whether or not what is the cost of running this? So the cost of training is lengthy, and I'm not sure that there's ways to get around this. reinforcement learning is sort of notoriously data inefficient. But we take 20 years to be able to navigate a city as well. So I'm not sure that I would expect it to not take a long training time. The actual running of the algorithm, the feed-forward operation, is very efficient, right?
Whether it has, the question is whether you can only use it as sort of a central learning system, or whether every consumer product in every house could do this sort of learning at this scale task.
I mean, I think so. I think that's one of the reasons why we're moving to more distributed approaches, where we're able to have different, we generate lots of different actors, and they're learning in different environments, and then we just sort of pass parameters back and forth as they're learning. This should allow also learning through heterogeneous systems, where you might have different consumer products learning within a single household. You need your Roomba to learn about navigation in your house over time, but also be able to communicate with maybe something that's more central. It'd be interesting to talk about it further.
Hi, thanks for your great talk. I will give you two questions. The first one, how to solve 3D navigation based on 3D place cell and head direction cell to help neuroscience to discover the 3D grid cell. The second question is, what's the main difference between your method and RADSLAM? Thanks.
Right, good. Let me ask the second one. Let me answer the second one first. So RADSLAM was one of the inspirations for this work. We're looking at what neural-inspired methods there were for navigation, and of course came across RADSLAM. RADSLAM is not learned. It is a computational model that has been defined in terms of how activations are propagated and how inference is done across there. So in contrast, this was interesting to neuroscientists, our work, because there was no prior knowledge that was used here. It was simply a simple network trained, and we have these emergent characteristics. What was the first question? I'm not sure that I got. Maybe you could repeat it.
How to solve 3D navigation based on 3D grid cell or 3D place cell, 3D head direction cell discovered in the bat. Yeah, so to help neuroscience to discover the 3D grid cell.
Yeah, I think that the work on understanding how, obviously most of the work has been done in rodents, in rats, and so it's all 2D. I think that it's fascinating to understand how humans use grid cells, how bats use grid cells, how primates use grid cells as well. There's some really fascinating work that seems to, based in part on the 3D grid cell results in bats, that seems to show that humans use grid cells as a way of understanding abstract concepts like size and shape deformations, which is very interesting. So yes, lots of good work there. I think that we may start looking at 3D grid cells and place cells as well for future work.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, so put your hand up really high if you're really excited to ask a question. And everyone with the microphones, spot those people. So put your hands up if you have a question, and we're going to try and cover as many as we can. So, okay, you got it? Looking around, who's next? Okay, she's next for now. Go ahead.
Thank you. I really enjoy your work. So I have a question concerning the MERLIN agent. So I found it really interesting that you talked the agent actually has better navigation policies when it has fuzzy reconstruction of the input. So I'm wondering if the VAE is actually working in the feature space instead of the pixel space. Then in reinforcement learning, you can try to encourage the agent only try to capture the features that are crucial for navigation instead of also ignoring those noises in the other pixels. Might that be more efficient? Thank you.
Yeah, so what we found when we first were developing this architecture, we were training the two parts of it separately. So the VAE was they were trained simultaneously, but without gradients backpropping from the main objective. And what we saw was that you could get really good reconstructions, but it didn't necessarily help performance in the task. Right? And that's because presumably it's not the visual features, it's not memorizing what the wallpaper is that's important. It's understanding something that's more abstract about the topology, the maze, and et cetera. So when we started backpropping gradients all the way through, including through the VAE, then what we saw then is this trade-off that if you try to make the reconstruction loss too high, then you lose the ability to navigate well. And so presumably that's those gradients fighting a little bit between reconstruction and between good policy, which means learning different things about the environment, not just the color of the wallpaper.
Raia, can I use my prerogative as the session chair to ask you one question too?
Sure.
So this is from Robert Boyle. He would ask, what are the failure modes? So specifically, does it ever fail when given a start and a goal? Does it always succeed 100% of the time? Are there cases where it fails?
So what we see is, as you would expect, that the longer and longer that you train, the harder it is to trick it. So in the simulations, in the mazes, then we're able to do things like make the environment twice as big, 3 times as big, 10 times as big, and see how long it takes to break the agent. When it breaks in a very uninteresting no, I wouldn't say that. In an unsatisfying way, in that a human would keep on trying to explore, right, and find the goal. But the agent starts just going in circles endlessly. In what we see in training in Street View, for instance, in New York City, is that the agent will sometimes get into an area where it basically doesn't know where it is, and it will go back and forth down a street, sort of turn in circles a lot, sort of like we would do if we were lost. But it always gets out of that and manages to just pick a direction and go, which I think we get less degenerate behavior there because of the higher complexity of the environment.
Hi.
Excuse me, ma'am. Yes.
Hi.
So the question I have is like the motivation behind this, your work. Your talk is inspiring and intriguing.
Where are you?
I am
Wave your
here
hand.
In your front, 12 o'clock.
Okay, sorry.
So the question is, like, in some aspect, mimicking humans is a good approach, but here, I feel like if we have a map available of a city, like which say like 1 GB of data, and I can just use that as a simple way to navigate a city. And is there any other motivation behind like using without map, navigating without city, navigating the city without map?
Right. I mean, maps are obviously incredibly powerful, and map algorithms make sense. Don't try to do this for your self-driving car. There are better ways to navigate if you have the map, and if you want to use that. For me, it's about understanding whether or not deep reinforcement learning is an approach that can solve these much more complex problems. I mean, I'm looking for algorithms that scale, that are as powerful as a convnet is when run across lots of images, but that it will instead give us scaling over time and over experience. I think that that's the way forward for AGI, is to find the right methods. And so that's one of our main motivations at DeepMind, is solving that. If I wanted to solve how to get, the fastest way to get across a city, using a map makes sense. But fundamentally, we're trying to push the boundaries of these algorithms and these approaches and see what works and see what scales.
Thank you.
Hi.
Well, we need to, Ken, I think that, do we need to let people go to the next? One more.
Thank you. Last question. That's awesome. Thanks. I think most of us in this room are very, very interested in the last slide of yours, because we all work on parts of in a stack, So I'm wondering, for your opinion, the other two problems, they all have abundance of data, right, so that we can train on. However, for robotics data, especially real robot data, it's very, very scarce and very expensive to produce. So, for example, like your navigation task, if I want to put it on a real robot in an entirely new environment, although I only have parts of the network to train, it's still, I'm wondering how much data are we talking about in order to achieve these kind of things?
Right. It's not cheap data-wise, and that's the biggest problem for robots. One of the biggest. I mean, I think that data efficiency is challenging, but I think it just takes thinking about the problem differently. Do we need to have, you know, I can imagine a lot of robots being deployed, a lot of cheap robots being deployed, gathering data, doing that exploration, learning, pooling their gradients, and learning that way. One can also learn in simulations. Simulations are getting better and better and better, and then do sim-to-real transfer to bring those to the real world, just giving yourself that jump forward, and then doing more learning in the real world. I think that there's a lot of ways to do this. I think that we need robots with hardware that is robust enough that it can learn for a lifetime. At least a robot lifetime, or at least overnight. So we need robust robots, and we need sort of believers that say, yes, end-to-end learning will get us to a completely different set of capabilities than the modular approach. And I think that there's ways to do this. So believe.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Raia. Thank you all.
All right, thank you.